Beijing Institute of Peace and Diplomatic Studies. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome you all to listeners and to my Chinese friend, Tadia Hao. Well, it's an interesting story about the China's reforms since 1978, which is called Gai Ge Kaifang in Chinese language. I mean the reforms and the opening up. I've been there, so I'm not economist, but student of international relations. So we'll try to cover both things. Dr. Shazia Ghani talked about the China's reforms and the success story. It's really interesting to know that China did not follow any model of reform. That what should be the model? That's why that was totally the indigenous process or the indigenous model, what we can say. And later on, if we compare it with the other East Asian states, and especially with the socialist economies and socialist states in Eastern Europe and also in the former Soviet Union, so it was different from them, not only in its nature, but also that it continues. Those who are collapsed are either the East European states, they later on joined the European Union. But the Chinese case is different, that still that process of reform that is going on, that is in continuation, and that is different from those economies. And even China, it is now portraying a different kind of model, that even it is engaged with the world by joining the World Trade Organization back in 2001 and some other institutions, but even it has taken initiatives in various sectors, such like in BRI, in Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, etc. So let's to talk about that. What were those stages where China took starting of its reforms? First was decentralization. That China decentralized its system and allowed it brought into the village and town councils on those levels, and I mean more freedom was given to them, that okay, you can have your business and even you can control your fiscal and administrative structures, and even in the foreign direct investment, you people are allowed to have their FDI. Second, that is the pragmatism and transitional institutions, that it was the most successful example of a transitional institution, which was the township and village enterprise, an enterprise form that operated outside the plan, but which was owned and to some extent managed by the local government across rural China. So it's really interesting to know that at that time, China was one of the core countries of the world. But since then, in the last 40 years, it is on the track which is developing more and more. And let me tell you that the China's economy in the first 20 years, I mean in the first 2 decades after the reforms, it expanded by 5 times, and its foreign trade by 12 times. Consumption levels greatly increased for nearly half of the world's people in poverty. From being an isolated autarkic economy, China through 1990s absorbed about half of the foreign direct investment, which flows to developing economies. From having no trade or investment ties with Taiwan and South Korea, by the 1990s, China was the first or second largest export diamond destination of one and the third largest of the other. So that's why it's important to know, and why the East Asian countries, they are accommodating China and they are not, blocking the China's rise. The pace of change has been maintained over the second 20 years of the reform period. The economy in 2017, that was 5.3 times larger than in 1998, and international trade 12.6 times. The information networks in which ordinary citizens participate within and beyond China have expanded beyond the wildest imagination of 20 years ago. So, Another important thing that first these reforms, as Dr. Shazia pointed out, these were gradual, not abruptly and not simultaneously. Of course, they had to work about the core modernization, for which the first premier and the first foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, he also worked back in the early 1970s. But these were also then later on adopted by the second generation of the Chinese leadership in the shape of Deng Xiaoping, when he introduced these reforms, socialism with Chinese characteristics. So those four modernization in agriculture and industry, science and technology, and in the national defense, those were carried on by the second generation of the Chinese leadership. So these reforms, these were in two stages. First, they were in the later half of 1970s and in the early 1980s, and mostly, of course, that was in agriculture sector. That even communes, those were abolished, and the village and town councils or enterprises, those were incorporated. And the second stage of reform, those were in the later half of 1980s and mostly in 1990s. In 1990s, yes, mostly the banks and industries, those were under the government control, the state owned it, but later on even these were, became market oriented. And more and more FDI became and started in back in 1990s. These were some about the economic reforms. Now about the political stage. So when Deng Xiaoping he came into power after the Mao death, he announced a policy that is called good neighborliness policy. It is very important in the sense that China revisited its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence when China and India signed it back in 1954. The good neighborliness policy was what that China and Soviet Union, they had border war, China and Vietnam. This was later on in 1979. China and India, they fought war. The Korean War and all the bad experiences what China faced. So Deng Xiaoping decided that what kind of relations we would have with our neighbors, especially the political one, where neighbors had conflicts with China, but we would leave them aside, but let's to have trade more and more. So that is, the point. If we see that today's the current trade volume between China and India, so this is about $85 billion per year. So the annual volume, but if you look to the problem, so their border is still undemarcated, the Dalai Lama, of course there are some kind of issues, but still their trade that is increasing day by day. Same is the case, look to the China and East Asia relationship. China is too much engaged with East Asian states, not only through BRI, through the China-Vietnam-Cambodia corridor, but also through bilateral relationships with Taiwan, which is of course China considers to be a part of it, Japan and South Korea, and more in ASEAN plus 3 formula. Further to say, this is the historical legacy of China and the leadership. What China had developed, even Adam Smith, he has described China that it was one of the largest economies in the world in ancient times, if you look before the 16th century. But after that it declined, especially in 19th and in the first half of 20th centuries, China economically declined. So about this relationship of China and East Asia, that is further cemented by the Deng policy, that was the good neighborliness. And look, there is no balance of power. There are no balancing factors. It is totally a different story from the Europe. If you look to the European history, in Europe the rising powerful state, that was a threatening, and there was balancing or bandwagoning against the rising power. But in East Asia, China still is a dominant power, one of the dominant powers, powerful country, rising day by day, economically it is progressing, second largest economy, but no balancing, no bandwagoning. Other states, they are not falling China down, right? Why? Because there remain hierarchy. So hierarchical concept and anarchical concept, these are two different. Anarchical that was practiced in Europe, but hierarchical, according to David Champa, these are the concepts which were given by China, the suzerainty concepts, where the East Asian states, they had to pay tributes to the China's king, and China was responsible, to assure the security in one way or the other. So still that is being practiced. Those are the cultural linkages for which Deng Xiaoping emphasized. And on the other hand, in South Asia, China is too much engaged, especially in infrastructure development, in seaports building, Chittagong, the Hanbatota in Sri Lanka, and Maldives and Pakistan, Gwadar. And you look in Central Asia through BRI, through the bilateral engagements, the gas and oil exploration, and so many other things. So by this I mean that in all its surrounding neighborhood in East Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia, and also in Eurasia and Russia, there is no balance of power, or no country is having that kind of attitude, behavior towards China, to call it down. So I mean that Chinese reforms, not only economically but also politically, these are very much interesting, and that is still an ongoing process where China is engaging with the world more and more, as in Shanghai Cooperation Organization and WTO and MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime, and all these things, you can notice the position and the China's role and more engagement with the world day by day. Of course, we can learn so many things from China in this regard. First, that is also the good neighborliness policy. Thanks to the current government that Prime Minister Imran Khan announced about that, we would try our best to have very good relations with our neighbors.